Hey everyone, this is a piece by Raya Dunayevskaya titled A New Revision of Marxian Economics. It was published in the American Economic Review, Volume 34, Issue 3, September 1944. The article from Podznamenem Marxisma under the banner of Marxism. The article from Podznamenem Marxisma under the banner of Marxism, which is published in this issue of American Economic Review appears to be merely a criticism of the old methods of teaching political economy in the quote curricula and textbooks end quote of the higher Soviet schools. Actually, it is no mere reproof of pedagogical error. Footnote. Published in the American Economic Review, Volume 34, Issue 3, September 1944, pages 531 to 537, Dunayevskaya's A New Revision of Marxian Economics accompanied and critiqued teaching of economics in the Soviet Union. The article she had translated from the Russian theoretical journal Podznamenem Marxisma under the banner of Marxism. Dunayevskaya's critique provoked great controversy, reaching the front page of the New York Times in October 1944 and drawing responses in American Economic Review from Oscar Lange, Leo Rogin, and Paul Baran. For Dunayevskaya's rejoinder to her critics, see American Economic Review, September 1945. See also the Raya Dunayevskaya Collection 213. End footnote. Its raison d'etre is contained in the argument that the law of value, in the law of value's Marxian interpretation, functions under quote socialism end quote. This is a clear departure from the former economic doctrine which prevailed not merely in the schools but in the most authoritative and scholarly publications as well as throughout the Soviet press. That this treatise appears now is an indication of the lines along which Soviet political economy may be expected to develop in the post-war period. Foreign observers who have carefully followed the development of the Soviet economy have long noted that the Soviet Union employs almost every device conventionally associated with capitalism. Soviet trusts, cartels, and combines, as well as the individual enterprises within them, are regulated according to strict principles of cost accounting. Prices of commodities are based upon total cost of production, including wages, raw materials, administrative cost, amortization charges, and interest, plus planned profit and the various taxes imposed as revenue on the maintenance of the state. Essential to the operation of Soviet industry are such devices as banks, secured credit, interest, bonds, bills, notes, insurance, and so on. As the present document explains it, quote, denial of the law of value created insurmountable difficulties in explaining the existence of such categories under socialism, end quote. The article, quote, Some Questions of Teaching of Political Economy, end quote, contends that although the law of value operates in Russia, it functions in a changed form, that the Soviet state subordinates the law of value and consciously makes use of the law of value's mechanism in the interest of socialism. In order to show that the operation of the law of value is consistent with the existence of socialism, the article cites those passages from the critique of the Gotha program in which Marx states that in a socialist society, quote, as it emerges from capitalist society, end quote, the laborer will receive in return for a given quantity of work the equivalent of such labor in means of consumption. The present authors reject, however, the formula that flows from these passages, namely that labor will be paid by the, quote, natural measure of labor, end quote, time. This, the document states, is not in, the authors are being referred to that are not Dunayevskaya, but from, in reference to the article that she's reviewing here. The present authors reject, however, the formula that flows from these passages, namely that labor will be paid by the, quote, natural measure of labor, end quote, time. This, the document states, is not in consonance with the experience of Russia, where labor is highly differentiated according to degree of skill and disregards intellectual and physical differences. The authors therefore propose a new slogan, quote, distribution according to labor, end quote. The authors consider that they have thus translated the law of value into a function of socialism, it should be noted that they thereby completely identify, quote, distribution according to labor, end quote, with distribution according to value. There is incontrovertible evidence that there exists in Russia at present a sharp class differentiation based upon a division of function between the workers on the one hand and the managers of industry, millionaire kolkhozniki, political leaders, and the intelligentsia in general on the other. It is this which explains certain tendencies which began to appear after the initiation of the five-year plans and have since become crystallized. The juridical manifestation of this trend culminated in 1936 in the abolition of the early Soviet Constitution. The Constitution, which was adopted in the early Soviet constitution's place, legitimized the existence of the intelligentsia as a special, quote, group, end quote, in Soviet society. This distinction between the intelligentsia and the mass of workers found its economic expression in the formula, quote, from each according to his labor, end quote. This formula should be compared with the traditional Marxist formula, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, end quote. Quote, each according to his need, end quote, has always been considered a repudiation of the law of value. The document, however, states that, quote, distribution according to labor, end quote, is to be effected through the instrumentality of money. This money is not script notes or some bookkeeping term, but money as the price expression of value. According to the authors, quote, the measure of labor and measure of consumption in a socialist society can be calculated only on the basis of the law of value, end quote. The whole significance of the article, therefore, turns upon whether it is possible to conceive of the law of value functioning in a socialist society, that is, a non-exploitative society. Marx took over from classical political economy its exposition of the law of value in the sense that labor was the source of value, and socially necessary labor time the common denominator governing the exchange of commodities. Marx, however, drew from this labor theory of value his theory of surplus value. He criticized classical political economy for mistaking the apparent equality reigning in the commodity market for an inherent equality. The laws of exchange, Marx contended, would give this appearance of equality only... The law of exchange, Marx contended, could give this appearance of equality only because value, which regulates exchange, is materialized human labor. One second. Where am I? Marx criticized classical political economy for mistaking the apparent equality reigning in the commodity market for an inherent equality. The laws of exchange, Marx contended, could give this appearance of equality only because value, which regulates exchange, is materialized human labor. When the commodity labor power is bought, equal quantities of materialized labor are exchanged, but since one quantity is materialized in a product, money, and the other in a living person, the living person may be and is made to work beyond the time in which the labor produced by him is materialized in the means of consumption necessary for his reproduction. To understand the nature of capitalist production, it is therefore necessary, Marx contended, to leave the sphere of exchange and enter the sphere of production. There it would be found that the dual nature of commodities, their use value and value, merely reflects the dual nature of labor, concrete and abstract labor embodied in them. For Marx, the dual character of labor is, quote, the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns, end quote. Marx, Capital. Marx called the labor process of capital the process of alienation. Abstract labor is alienated labor, labor estranged not merely from the product of its toil, but also in regard to the very process of expenditure of its labor power. Once in the process of production, the labor power of the worker becomes as much a, quote, component part, end quote, of capital as fixed machinery or constant capital, which is again the worker's materialized labor. According to Marx, Ricardo, quote, sees only the quantitative determination of exchange value, that is, it is equal to a definite quantity of labor time. But Ricardo forgets the qualitative determination that individual labor must, by means of that individual labor's alienation, be presented in the form of abstract universal social labor. End quote. Marx. Some theories of surplus value. In its Marxian interpretation, therefore, the law of value entails the use of the concept of alienated or exploited labor, and as a consequence the concept of surplus value. Hitherto all Marxists have recognized this fact. Hitherto Soviet political economy adhered to this interpretation. In 1935, Mr. A. Leontiev, one of the present editors of Poznamenem Marxisma, wrote, quote, "The Marxian doctrine of surplus value is based, as we have seen, on Marx's teaching of value. That is why it is important to keep the teaching of value free from all distortions, because the theory of exploitation is built upon it." End quote. A. Leontiev. Bracket. You are saying that the ruling class in Russia, quote, owns, end quote, the means of production. What you are saying in reality is that the ruling class is in such a productive relation to the working class that the means of production thereby become capital. That is what Marx means by saying that capital was conditioned on wage labor. That is what Marx meant by saying that capital was conditioned on wage labor. If you don't want that, then back to the old degenerated worker state conception, end bracket. And again, quote, "It is perfectly clear that this division of labor into concrete and abstract labor exists only in commodity production. The dual nature of labor reveals the classic contradiction of commodity production," end quote. That is from Political Economy, a Beginner's Course, which is in, published in the Soviet Union, I guess. The new article contradicts this theory and this theory's past interpretation. It recognizes the existence in Russia of concrete and abstract labor, but denies the contradiction inherent in the dual nature of labor. It recognizes the pivot upon which political economy turns, but denies the basis of exploitation, which to all Marxists as well as to opponents of Marxism has hitherto been the essence of the Marxist analysis. This is the problem the article must solve. It is interesting to watch how this is done. In place of the class exploitation, which was the basis of the Marxist analysis, the new theoretical generalization proceeds from the empirical fact of the existence of the USSR, assumes socialism is irrevocably established, and then propounds certain, quote, laws of a socialist society, end quote. These are 1, the industrialization of the national economy, and 2, the collectivization of the nation's agriculture. It must be stated here that both these laws are not laws at all. Laws are a description of economic behavior. The laws the article mentions are statements of fact. What follows the law as a manifestation of the, quote, objective necessity of a socialist society. What follows the laws as a manifestation of the, quote, objective necessity of a socialist society, end quote, quote, distribution according to labor, end quote, does partake of the character of a law. Quote, objective necessity, end quote, it must be remarked, does not rise from the economic laws. The economic laws rise from the objective necessity. It may of course manifest itself differently in the Soviet Union, but the manifestations the present authors cite are precisely the ones that emanate from capitalist society. The document fails to make any logical connection between the new basis, quote, socialism, end quote, and the law characteristic of capitalist production, the law of value. The implication that the state is really, quote, for, end quote, the principle of paying labor according to needs, but is forced by objective necessity to pay according to value, is precisely the core of Marx's theory of value. The supreme manifestation of the Marxian interpretation of the law of value is that labor power, exactly as any other commodity, is paid at value, or receives only that which is socially necessary for labor power's reproduction. This startling reversal of Soviet political economy is neither adventitious nor merely conciliatory. That is the real significance of the article. It is a theoretical justification of social distinctions enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. That this elaborate theoretical justification is made is proof that the Russian people are being prepared for the continuance of a social relation which had no place in the conception of the founders of communism or the founders of the Soviet state. The article argues that the law of value has operated not only in capitalism but also has existed from time immemorial. As proof, its present existence in the Soviet Union is cited, and a reference is made to Engels' statement that the law of value has existed for some 5,000 to 7,000 years. Engels' statement, however, is contained in an article in which he deals with the law of value only insofar as commodity prices reflect the exact value of commodities. The Marxian thesis is that the more backward the economy, the more exactly do prices of individual commodities reflect value. The more advanced the economy, the more commodity prices deviate. They then sell at prices of production, though in the aggregate all prices are equal to all values. In that sense, Engels states the law of value has operated for thousands of years, that is, ever since simple exchange and up to capitalist production. There's a critique of this whole explanation, like the Engels, this historico-logical reading of Marx's critique of political economy that was kind of like pioneered or initiated by Engels. That once upon a time, to explain the apparent the transformation problem, which is the problem of how of that in Volume 1. It appears that the regulator of prices is value, whereas the regulator of prices in Volume 3 is prices of production, which is total capital invested plus the average rate of profit, with branches of production with radically different labor, or technical and value compositions, right? So companies or industries that only require very little labor power, say like a chemical plant or something like that, which is very mechanized or something like that. And then like other industries, say like a sweatshop that produces clothing, requires a lot of labor. But in the end of the day, regardless, they all acquire the same amount of profit, and it's they empirically do, but that is like the tendency is for them to all gather the equal profit, and if they don't get equal profits, they change industries. They stop investing in the industry that has low profits and start investing in the industry that has high profits. Anywho, the idea that's being explained here is that what Engels tried to do was kind of say that, like, okay, well, once upon a time there was this like kind of like time when commodity producers were face to face and everybody kind of knew how much labor everything took. And therefore, and since there hadn't been such since it was prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was less diversification in value composition within plants. So like there's less diversity in terms of how much labor to means of production were being used in any given plant, any given production venture. Before it was prior to that, commodities did exchange at their values, and now that capital has such diversified industries, now commodities are sold at not by their value but by their prices of production, but this kind of posits something that I think which is typical of like Engels' critique, Engels' analysis of the opening chapters of Volume 1, where, like, especially the third section of Chapter 1 of Capital, which is about value form, which is so important for value form analysis, puts forward the proposition that what is being discussed there is like a generalized history distilled of kind of like contingent distortions, right? So there's this idea, like Engels has this idea that what Marx is doing in that early chapter is talking in broad strokes about the transition from a supposed barter economy to a commodity, a society based upon commodity, generalized commodity sales and purchases, and the value form people, generally speaking, tend to critique that understanding of that third section of Chapter 1 of Capital, and say that what Marx is doing is demonstrating that value must necessarily be expressed in exchange value, meaning that value can only be expressed in a commodity, in a commodity besides the the relative commodity, like that. Basically, putting forward the idea that like value is not inherent in a thing and can only be becomes real via exchange, via the value of one commodity becoming expressed in another commodity, and that what this whole kind of thing presupposes is that like people are acting without thinking, or like doing things without needing to know what's going on, right? They just need to know. Sorry, I'm tired. I'm rambling on. Basically, what they're trying to deduce is that what that idea is trying to demonstrate is like the necessity of money for a society whose economic core is oriented around value production, and not some kind of like historical gloss about how once upon a time there was barter, and then there was then there was a general equivalent. Then the general equivalent. It took some time for the appropriate general equivalent to be established. So maybe at first it was cows, and then it was gold and then it became gold at one point. It's not what that opening chapter is about. So there's a pretty substantial literature that like critiques this whole kind of thing here, which is relevant to that whole historico-logical argument, and that's kind of what's being expressed here. But in the simple commodity production, which is being supposed here, which is where like the law of value is like at its purest or something like that, and then only later do commodities no longer exchange at their values. So there's an article. I would just check out any of the value form pieces, but probably the most important one for this particular issue, important theoretical issue, is Chris Arthur's The Myth of Simple Commodity Production, which is on this channel. Now, it's debatable, this is a side note, it's debatable whether a simple commodity producing society ever existed, right? If that's an actual like thing that we can say existed, that's a different question. Now there might be evidence for that. But what is strictly being spoken of here is like how the analysis of value in Marx's critique of political economy is presented, and it is not presented as a historical retelling without contingent imperfections. That's not that's what those people are arguing, is that that's not what Marx is talking about in that section. Not that they're not saying that it may, like, even though they might just, a lot of them I think probably do disagree with the idea of there ever being like a simple commodity producing society. But that's not really the point of what they're talking about. Anyway, let me reread that just because I've been fucking talking so long. The Marxian thesis that the more backward the economy, the more exactly do prices of individual commodities reflect value. The more advanced the economy, the more commodity prices deviate. They then sell at prices of production, though in the aggregate all prices are equal to all values. In that sense, Engels states, the law of value has operated for thousands of years, that is, ever since simple exchange and up to capitalist production. Footnote. Engels on Capital. Published with International Publishers, 1937. End footnote. The Engels did not in any way depart from value as an exploitative relation, characteristic only of capitalist production, can best be seen from Mr. Leontiev's own preface to the little booklet, Engels on Capital. There the Soviet economist says, quote, whereas at the hands of the social democratic theoreticians of the epoch of the Second International, the categories value, money, surplus value, etc., have a fatal tendency to become transformed into disembodied abstractions inhabiting the sphere of exchange, and far removed from the conditions of revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. Engels shows the most intimate, indissoluble connection that these categories have with the relations between classes in the process of material production, with the aggravation of class contradictions, with the inevitability of the proletarian revolution, end quote. A. Leontiev. Value, Engels has written, is, quote, a category characteristic only of commodity production, and just as value did not exist prior to commodity production, so value will disappear with the abolition of commodity production, end quote. I think that's a very important statement, actually. Because that value is a part of commodity production. It's not a trans-historical feature of production of goods. Production of objects is a particular social relation. And I think, for me, this is just a personal thought, is that commodity production and generalized commodity exchange as well, not just commodity production, is kind of like what is the core of being critiqued. I think the critique, or at least for me, like if I was trying, I guess this is what I'm saying, is if I was trying to explain the critique of political commodity on a basic level, I would not try to explain like the critique of value, as important as that is. I'd try to explain what are the necessary features of a commodity producing society, and why and then try to explain how that creates a heteronymous fetishistic relations between human beings that operate through them but over and against them at the same time. I would try to explain, like, I think instead of saying I abolish value, like, which is like what would happen, I'd emphasize abolishing commodity production. Which isn't necessarily market-oriented, by the way. Some people try to talk about value production as if you can talk about value without markets, which is very, very bizarre to me. And that would be kind of like, in my opinion, that would be kind of the cornerstone, the decisive $1 million question as to whether the USSR was capitalist or not, is whether some type of competitive market relations existed, or like, not to say that there wasn't like monopoly is not like hostile to value production, but and neither is state intervention in value production. But that's for me, that's kind of like the linchpin. It's like, did the form, the forms associated with value, capitalism has its dual character. It has its material dimension, which is, interrelates but is fundamentally dictated by the value dimension of capitalism. And it does that value dimension, does that market dimension exist in the Soviet Union? That's the $1 million question. Not whether it's exploitative or not whether it's whether the ruling class tries to hoard as much surplus to itself as possible. What matters is whether that surplus takes the form of value, and whether that surplus takes the form of and whether the product takes the form of a commodity. Yeah. I don't know. I'm talking out my ass. I'm delirious. It would be sheer absurdity, argued Engels, quote, to set up a society in which at last the producers control their products by the logical application of an economic category, value, which is the most comprehensive expression of the subjection of producers by their own product, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because that's a very good quote, actually. Good job, Engels. It would be sheer absurdity, argued Engels, quote, to set up a society in which at last the producers control their products by the logical application of an economic category, value, which is the most comprehensive expression of the subjection of producers by their own product, end quote. In the last theoretic writing we have from the pen of Marx, a critique of Adolf Wagner's Allgemeine oder theoretische Volkswirtschaftslehre. Marx castigates, quote, the presupposition that the theory of value developed for the explanation of bourgeois society has validity for the, quote, socialist state and of Marx, end quote, end quote. I need to read that comment on Wagner, or whatever it's called, it's in the text on method that Terrell Carver put out. I had never read that, and I need to. It's in aporia, I think might be the word, in my knowledge. Where am I? In the opinion of this writer, nothing in the article contradicts this firmly established coexistence of the law of value with capitalist production. The radical change in theoretical interpretation that the article presents not unnaturally brings with it important methodological consequences. The author proposes that in the future the structure of Capital, the book, be not followed, and state that the past textbooks which followed the structure violated the, quote, historic principle, end quote. Obviously, this is a very grave departure. Engels explains Marx's rejection of the method of the, quote, historical school, end quote, by the fact that history proceeds by jumps and zigzags, and that in order to see history's inner coherence, it was necessary to abstract from the accidental. The structure of Marx's Capital is a logical abstraction seen in its evolution and constantly checked and rechecked and illustrated by historical development. Again, that's a maybe it's, if you're not familiar with the Marxist critique of political economy, that's kind of a controversial statement. The book is not a historical book. Obviously, it views capitalism as a specific historical mode of production, which had a beginning and has an end. That's a presupposition that Marx brings to it, but that's fundamentally not what the book is about. The book is not about is not a movement from a simpler society to a more complex society, in some kind of like I don't know, stripped down logical historical kind of presentation. It's not like that. It's not that kind of book. It's about a system. It's about conceptualizing and critiquing a system, and and reproducing the social totality of capitalism in thought, as a system, not as like a. It's not a history of capitalism in like theoretical language. It's not a sophisticated gloss on the history of capitalism. It's about the necessary features of the capitalism as a system. Yeah, at least that's what some people would say to Raya Dunayevskaya reading this. Maybe I tend to feel that way too, but I am, I think a lot of people view it as the concept of the ideal average of capitalism, being what of the ideal average of capitalism being what capital seeks to reproduce in thought. Anyway, back to the text. Marx's dialectic method is deeply rooted in history. However, Marx's dialectic method utilizes history not as a chronological listing of events, but, quote, divested of its historical forms and fortuitous circumstances, end quote. That's Engels, I believe. Yeah, that's Engels in On the Materialism and Dialectics of Marx, included in Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy. Thus, the abstract method of Marx, back to the end footnote, back to the text. Thus, the abstract method of Marx does not depart from the, quote, historic principle, end quote. On the contrary, the theoretical development of the commodity is in reality the historical development of society from a stage when the commodity first makes its appearance, the surplus of primitive communes, to its highest development, its, quote, classic form, end quote, in capitalism. That is precisely what I was saying earlier, is what the value form theorists would argue against. Where a commodity existed accidentally or held a subordinate position, as in primitive slave or feudal societies, the social relations, whatever we may think of them, were at any rate clear. Again, I would, there's different ways to cut this. And Marx says, Marx initially has this idea in say like the Communist Manifesto period, or at least in the Communist Manifesto text, of society once being obscured by religious, the importance of religion and ontologized hierarchies of human beings, being mystifying the exploitative relationship, right? And people say that, and so like. But then he said that capitalism shows class society in its like most clearest form of like callousness and like brutality. It's like naked. Naked coldness is, I guess, is what is fully on display. And then later Marx talks about how actually the exploitative nature of class society and the heteronymous force of value is not actually particularly transparent, and requires 3 fat fucking books to explain how complicated, how like on all different levels capitalist relations are like naturalized and fetishized, and like human activities are not acknowledged as human activities that are potentially are historically specific, but as like transhistorical facts of life. He takes 3 books to do that. So like right here, that's the train of thought that like Raya Dunayevskaya is operating on, is that capitalism is more subtle than these other forms of relationships, which I think is probably right. On the other hand, I do not think that more primitive societies, or like more like pre-capitalist societies, were characterized by greater transparency of social hierarchies. I think that's kind of reading what we see now into the past. Like if you look at like slavery, or you look at feudal society, if you look at like lords and absolute monarchs and all that kind of things that you like associate with feudalism and stuff, looking at it now, you can look back at it and see as it was. But I would be very much doubtful if that is how, if the nakedness of exploitation was as perceptible at the time. Anyway, so that I'm just saying that is like, I think Raya Dunayevskaya is right here. That capitalism is, in a sense, more mystified than these other relations. In another sense, it's not. I just want to say that there's contradictory, at least within Marx, there's ambivalences depending on what text you're drawing from. Where a commodity existed accidentally, sorry, I keep fucking stopping, but I'm feeling chatty. Where a commodity existed accidentally or held a subordinate position, as in primitive slave or feudal societies, the social relations, whatever we may think of those social relations, were at any rate clear. It is only like capitalism that these social relations assume, quote, the fantastic form of a relation between things, end quote. I think it's also interesting, sorry, this is a side note, but when Marx talks about fetishism, to like get a handle on what fetishism is, we have to put our minds into the misty realms of religion for like an appropriate analogy. Whereas like in religion, the products of men's heads come to take on powers of their own and subordinate the humans who had those thoughts to begin with, who created those things. Their creations come to dominate them. Religion being a not a natural product, but a social product. And we need to understand fetishism, we have to understand the fantastic form that the products, not of our heads, but of our hands make when our labor products assume the form of commodities. So if the religious, irrational features of previous societies obscured the clarity of what those societies were to the people that participated in them. Like, I do not think, for instance, like a tribal society, this is just me, this may be a controversial thing to say, but I don't think a tribal society that worships like pieces of wood, even though I'm completely sensitive to the way that like the supposed like irrationality of like indigenous people has been used as a pretext for conquering them, and that is fucking evil. But I don't think that those societies were free or something like that, or autonomous societies where people conducted human social life in a self-conscious way. I do not think that's what they were doing at all. But I think that like a society that, for instance, fetishizes a certain object and gives majestic powers to it and orients their social life around these supposed natural features of a particular object, they are not living in that society cannot be said to be a transparent society, and I don't believe you could say it was a free society either, even if hierarchies are limited and other things. There's other problems within a society besides just class hierarchies. What was I going to say? Yeah. So it's relevant that Marx had to go to that. It would probably be relevant to that idea of like whether or not past societies versus capitalist societies are more or less transparent than each other. Like that's the role of religion would be an important component of trying to sift that out, if you think that question's important. That is why Marx analyzes the commodity quote, its ripest, end quote. He is separating the commodity's theoretical potentialities from the commodity's historic starting point. Where Marx analyzes a commodity in order to discern the law of the commodity's development, the Soviet economists now merely proclaim the arrival of the commodity in a, quote, socialist society, end quote. Hence, when the authors propose that the structure of capital be not followed in the future, it is not because past Soviet textbooks patterned on it violated the, quote, historic principle, end quote. It is because of their need to divest the commodity of what Engels called, quote, the commodity's particular distinctness, end quote, and to turn the commodity into a classless, quote, general historic, end quote, phenomenon applicable to practically all societies. The ideas and methodology of the article are not accidental. They are the ideas and methodology of a, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, concerned with the acquisition of, quote, surplus products, end quote. And that word choice is not innocent. That word choice is significant. Saying surplus products as opposed to surplus value. It's not that it's untrue. It's just like, how is access to those surplus products being granted? Is it being granted? That's an important question for making the determination whether the USSR is capitalist or not. What is important is that this departure from, quote, past teaching of political economy, end quote, actually mirrors economic reality. The Soviet Union has entered the period of, quote, applied economics, end quote. Instead of theory, the article presents an administrative formula for minimum costs of maximum production. It is the constitution of Russia's post-war economy. That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. I appreciate you hearing me stagger through some thoughts I was having out loud. Like I always say, view them as irritating writings in the book that you wish weren't there. Alright, bye-bye.